Alrighty. So, after a brief break due to inconsiderate male members of the church.
Yes, self-centered.
Self-centered. Taking holidays, interrupting our Bible study. We're back. Ideally, obviously, we would have liked to have done them back to back because you've almost certainly forgotten just about everything that we spoke about in the last lesson, which is totally fine and understandable. In the last lesson, we were in the beginning of Galatians chapter 4. We covered verses 1 to 7. Today we're covering the following verses 8 to 11 of Galatians chapter 4. Obviously we'll spend a bit, well, we were going to be spending time anyway kind of referring back to sections in the first 7 verses anyway. We'll just have to do that a bit more comprehensively to just refresh our memory on what was covered in the last lesson. So we'll take care of that. But the argument is still flowing. The same argument or point that he's making here is kind of continuing through these verses that we're looking at today, right? So we'll read from the passage and then we'll go from there. So, are we ready? Cool. So, Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 11. However, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. But now, having known God, or rather having been known by God, how is it that you turn your back again to the weak and worthless elemental things, to which you want to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have laboured over you for nothing. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned just earlier in the intro, we're going to be spending a reasonable amount of time going back into the previous passage, right? So that we can understand, primarily because at least hopefully one of the things you may recall is this term of elemental things or elementary principles, stoicheia, which find itself featuring in verse 3. So verse 3, so also we, while we were children, were enslaved under the elemental things or elementary principles of the world. To refresh your memory on what that's referring to, the stoicheia, which is a well-known concept in the ancient Greek culture. In the ancient world, especially but not exclusively among the Greeks, the prevailing view was that, with good reason given their paganism, was that the elementary, what they called the elemental principles, particularly earth, water, air, and fire, were these primordial elements. So primordial meaning prime order, so first in order. Primordial meaning of going back to the origins of the world. Were deities in their own right. Much of the pagan mythologies of the ancient world, in one form or another, have a series of mythologies that, again, to one degree or another, in some form or another, have basically the same fundamental story among the pagans. Out of, and again, sometimes it varies, but generally speaking, out of a primordial chaos, which is often represented as an evil deity or demiurge figure, come a sky father and an earth mother, which is where we kind of have that English term of Mother Earth from. In the case of the Greeks, it was known as Gaia or Gaia, various different names among the pagans. And from there, all the various pantheon of the gods were then born, and you would have multiple generations of the deities. The elemental or elementary principles, of course where we get that word elemental from as well in English, were these part of that primordial state as far as pagan mythology is concerned. Long story short, stoicheia, as we explained in the last lesson, has a very kind of deep and profound meaning in the culture of thousands of years ago, of course, within which this is written. It is referring to basically the pagan worldview of the cosmos and how things actually work. It refers also to the heavens. It refers to the planets. Of course, this is why the planets are named after the Roman pantheon in the West, right? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. And this is the point that he is making, right? We were enslaved to these things, and he is drawing a kind of comparison in two forms: one for the pagan side and the other for the Jewish side, right? He's drawing a comparison. Again, we talked about this last lesson, so I won't go into this too heavily. But this imagery of guardianship, if you look there in verse 1 and 2, I'll read it again from verse 1 and 2. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and stewards until the date set by the father, right? So he's using this analogy of kind of real life childhood and inheritance and other such things to describe both the way in which, in this case, the Celts and Greeks among the congregation, right, or primarily the Celts in this case, the Galatians, were enslaved to pagan gods and to the pantheon of paganisms, particularly again in the Greek context here for this cultural context, and drawing an equality of comparison to the way in which the Israelites were under the yoke of the Mosaic law or the Mosaic code, especially the ceremonial aspect, right? So all the ritual components, to put it in colloquial terms. Right? He actually goes on to make this case very specifically later on in this chapter, kind of verses 26, 27, 28 roughly. We'll save that theology till we get there, obviously. The transition, of course, right, is verse 7. So if you look there at verse 7, therefore you are no longer a slave but a son, and if a son, an heir through God, right? So there is this inheritance, there is this kind of growing up, to use colloquial terms, that is in view in relation to this new covenant, right, through Jesus Christ. Old things being compared to new things, former to present, right? We then come to verse 8, and again, that's not where we're going to end our comparison. We'll be bouncing back and forth between last lesson's passage and this passage today. But verse 8, okay, which is the beginning of technically speaking, of our passage here today. However, at that time, so he's referring back to the past again, right? Just like it kind of was in verse 3 to a degree. However, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those things which by nature are no gods. That's a fairly direct little translation. What it's describing here is obviously the time past. So, however, at that time when you did not know God, so when you did not know Jesus Christ, when you were formerly, for the case of the Celtic Christians here, the Galatians, when you were worshipping the Greek pantheon, in the case here specifically, you did not know God, right? You were cut off from God, you were distant from him, and this is much of the story of the Old Testament that goes all the way back to, certainly effectively and definitively kind of Genesis 4, but particularly, of course, the events of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 of Genesis, and then what follows on from there, right? The nations are dispersed around the world after that rebellion. And from there, you have basically a tale of two people. You have the pagan nations all over the world, including our ancestors, whose stories and cultures kind of developed and growed out from that. You then had eventually Abraham and his descendants, and you have faithful among them, you have the unfaithful among the world. This new covenant, of course, is expanding that, kind of like we talked about on Sunday actually, out to the nations, right? The entire plan of redemption on God's part is to bring all the nations back to him, right? To bring them out of enslavement to paganism and to bring them back under the one true religion, okay? Here, he describes them in verse 8 as being enslaved to that which by nature are no gods. Okay, so let's dive into what he actually means there specifically. If this were a distant lesson, we would spend some time talking about the Greek. It's not particularly important here because it's fairly straightforward in English, and we can just talk about it in English that communicates it quite well. That which by nature are no gods, or even you could also perhaps say in English equally as well, that which by nature are not divine beings, could be a less direct but also equally valid translation. Okay. The way that the Bible speaks of gods or of the gods, so speaking of the pagan gods, is rather interesting, and it is quite deep. We can't spend the entire lesson talking about it, otherwise we wouldn't get to anything else. But in essence, you have this hierarchical view that is presented through the scriptures, right? Of course, from Genesis through to Revelation, there's one very clear message, which is monotheism, that there is only one true God. However, obviously it speaks in a context of ancient history wherein many people and beings, mortal or otherwise, were worshipped as deities, right, or gods. Okay? So when you have references to the gods, it's about putting that in context, right? There is a distinction that essentially the Bible draws between that which is by nature God, which is where we kind of obviously come to the really obvious wording for us in verse 8, just in a minute, and that which by practice are gods. Okay, so by nature and by practice, right? Interestingly, it is a distinction, and we've used these words before many times, but it's a difference between ontology and teleology, which are the philosophical terms. Ontology meaning the nature of something, so we are human beings ontologically, right? We are a human nature, that is to say, whereas the things sitting before me are not. Okay, they're different in nature; they have a different ontology. Teleology is the purpose of something. What is its reason for being? What is its end? Which is what that little word telos means in Greek. The purpose of something, the end of something. That's the distinction that the Bible draws, right? There is one God by nature, who is in his nature truly God, and then there are, of course, a whole host of other figures in the world which are worshipped as God in practical terms. Does that make sense? The distinction that's being drawn? Nature versus purpose or practice, more broadly. Okay, all manner of things are worshipped as gods in practical terms, but what the Bible very clearly kind of communicates, including obviously the Apostle Paul here, is that those things are not by nature true gods. Right? They're worshipped as such. They're on the surface, all the kind of external, all the externalities, pardon me, are that of a deity, right? Temples, shrines, sacrifices, rituals, religious practice, customs and practices, etc., priesthoods, high priesthoods, whatever happens to be, right? So you have all the externalities, but then again, that's that practical side, right? And you can have that, however, it's missing the true nature or substance, right? Which is really the deeper, more profound level. It's kind of, and we see this in all kinds of avenues. I mean, one that's maybe really, really obvious today is, and this would only work today, is things like artificial intelligence, for example. Artificial intelligence, especially in regards to what's called narrow artificial intelligence, so the kind that's working this computer right now, that's running the phone, that's running that camera, right, is a very effective tool. It's a very innovative one. There's nothing morally wrong with it in and of itself. But even such or more complex forms of narrow artificial intelligence, like language models, so what are called LLMs, language learning models, things like ChatGPT, the kind of things where you can type it in and it gives you all kinds of information, right, are but a mimicry of human intelligence, let alone divine intelligence. There is a distinction between, again, the actual nature of genuine intelligence, especially in the human context, versus the external appearance thereof, right? And that's why, of course, the A in AI is the most operative kind of word, artificial, right? It's not genuine intelligence. All that artificial intelligence can do is collate at superhuman speeds known information from other data sources on the internet, right? And when asked, AI will, especially those kind of language learning models like ChatGPT and others, will very clearly and explicitly say that it's not that I'm not a real intelligence. I can't have things like belief, for example. Faith is an impossibility for me. Blah blah blah. Right? It's a mimicry of intelligence. The reason why I point that out is to try and draw that comparison to what we're talking about here. Right? You can have all the externalities. You can have externalities that almost identically mirror the real thing, but at the end of the day, you can't actually reproduce the real substance, or in this case, nature, right? For the sake of this study today, I'm using terms like essence, nature, and substance synonymously. In philosophy, we make distinctions in philosophy between those terms at times, but for the simple level of this Bible study, essence, substance, nature, I'm all using synonymously, okay? Right? You can't fake that nature. It either has it or it doesn't have it. You can mimic externalities to quite a considerable degree, in fact. Just like in speaking of AI, just like the way in which now, especially by 2025, the quality of video that artificial intelligence is able to produce is extremely high. And that's only a very, very recent phenomenon. You used to be able to tell quite easily if something was produced by AI. It's becoming much more difficult as it learns what human movement actually looks like in the real world and other such things. However, at the end of the day, it will never be able to actually produce the real genuine substance of human intelligence because it's impossible to have it. Right? In this case, for this religious context, this is the kind of comparison I'm trying to draw. Right? Many things, many beings, many people are honoured and revered and worshipped as gods, but they are not by nature divine. They're not by nature God. Sometimes we do use the term divine in a broader context, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. So at times, angels when we discuss them in kind of colloquial terms, we refer to them as divine beings. It's not to confuse them as being God, but it's to refer to the difference between they and us, right? But in a general sense, when we refer to the divine, we're referring obviously to God himself, okay? Part of this also has to do with the fact that philosophically there can only be one God. That's a much more complex point, but to give you the simple synopsis, the true essence of deity, of divinity, has logically incumbent within it a number of parameters. This is something, actually, ironically speaking of the Greeks, that they kind of figured out quite early on, especially figures like Aristotle. So Aristotle is obviously one of the most famous of the Western philosophers, perhaps even one of the most famous in global history. He spoke of what's called the prime mover, or the unmoved mover, right? So he used philosophical reason to deduce that, and he used the example of an apple tree, right? An apple tree grows from a seedling form into a tree. It then produces apple fruits, right? Which then, of course, fall on the ground, and which then decay, and the seeds blow about, and then eventually one of those seeds plants itself in the ground, gets planted in the ground, in the soil, rain comes, and a new apple tree plants, right? He used the apple tree as an example of the cycle of life, right? Especially in the reproductive sense, right? And this goes for obviously people, animals, all kinds of things, right? The cycles of life that work its way through the world. Using that kind of philosophical reasoning of his, he worked his way backwards. If you keep going back from apple to tree to seedling to apple to tree to seedling, boom, boom, you eventually have to come to the point where there is the initial seed, right? Something must begin the cycle. It's kind of the cheap Timu version of philosophy would be the chicken and egg analogy. The answer is the chicken, by the way, because there's proteins in the egg which are only found in the reproductive organs of the chicken. But nevertheless, from a philosophical perspective, that's the kind of same analogy, right? So what he utilised, obviously, is that if there is a first seed, there must be one who creates that first seed, right? And so he's using this analogy to draw kind of philosophical conclusions about the divine, or the creation of the universe, and various other things, right? And so his deductions were very, very close to the biblical picture, because you can logically use human reason to kind of arrive at those points. In Aristotle's case, he concluded that that this prime mover, so prime meaning first, right, must be eternal, because time itself must have something that begins that time period. There must be a particular point where one of these things existed prior to the creation of time itself, which of course would make that being eternal by nature if it exists outside of time, right? I'm using the word "it" because the one distinction between the Bible and Aristotle's deductions is that he did not attribute personhood. That wasn't something that was in his view, nor for the Greeks anyway, right? I'll explain that more when we get further on. He also deduced that this prime mover must be all-powerful by virtue of what we see around us and the enormitude and complexity of the universe, the complexity all the way down to the microscopic level of the human body and the atomic structure of the world. The Greeks kind of were the first to discover the idea of the atom, at least as we know it. He also deduced that this being must have purpose. This being must also, by nature, be able to cause all things. So there's an omnipotency, as I mentioned earlier, etc., etc., etc. This is the description of the divine being. This, of course, is something that's very interesting in Aristotle's day, given the fact that, of course, you still have the worshipping of the Greek pantheon, who themselves are multiple generations of descendants from the original deities in Greek mythology. Right? This is usually how that ends up going, by the way, in ancient paganism. When we think of established ancient pagan pantheons, they are almost always, not literally, but almost always, either the next generation or even multiple generations of deities after the original deities in that religion. Right? There's usually always a great war. In the case of the Greeks, it's called the Titanomachy, the war of the Titans, where they waged war against their parents, and Zeus and his generation win, etc., etc. And you have this kind of story prevail. You even, of course, get scenarios where the deities can actually die, as in the case of the Norse pantheon, so the pantheon of the Germanic tribes, like the Vikings, for example, right, who we call the Vikings, right? The Norse, their entire eschatological event called Ragnarok is one where almost all the gods would die, except for one of them, Balder, who would then survive. He would protect two human beings, a man and a woman, and then they would recommence the creation, right? So the deities could often die in ancient pagan religion. That's why they were often so scheming and so careful with how they engaged each other. All these kinds of attributes are the story of human history and pagan culture that has travailed its way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In many respects, it's quite obvious how they come to be, especially in the kind of context which we have here. In this kind of context of the first century in the Greco-Roman world, of course, the concept of the Greek hero, which is where we actually get that English word hero from, is something which is central and really important in this time period in culture. So figures like Achilles, figures like Heracles, who we better know by his Roman name Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, all these various mortal men who did legendary things and did achieve great triumphs in life, were elevated to the status of a god, right? Some of them, of course, already had that incumbent in their stories, like Achilles, who was a demigod, so his mother was a nymph, which is a kind of sea deity. His father was a king, Perseus, Peleus, pardon me, and all of these kinds of things are what form or inform the nature, pardon the pun, of what he's referring to in this verse of verse 8. Okay, these things which by nature are no gods. Okay. It's not that they are not worshipped as such, but it's the reason why he used the Greek word physes, which is where we get words like physical from, or physics. Okay, the study of physics is the study of nature ultimately. Okay, and how the natural world operates, especially in regards to mechanics. Right, that which by nature are no gods or are not deities. Right, they're not truly divine. They are created beings, and this is what is so vitally important to understand as one of the most important distinctions. It's why I referenced Aristotle and gave a very oversimplified kind of synopsis of his teachings. In that, one of those key deductions was eternality. Okay, the divine, or the prime mover, as he called it, must be eternal because something must cause time itself to begin. Right. We obviously know that time had a beginning. That's a well-established scientific fact. Has been for quite a while now. Contrary to more Eastern views, again, generally speaking, in Eastern philosophy, especially things like Hinduism and Buddhism, the universe is seen as something eternal because of their conflation between the creation or the universe and the divine essence. Of course, in Buddhism, those are one and the same thing, right? As pantheists and panentheists in various different respects, everything that exists is part of the divine essence, right? And that's a conflation of the two. In this case, the eternal aspect is something that's so essentially important, right? Because what it really means to say that God is eternal is it also, by definition, is to say that God is uncreated, okay? It's why, for example, at times in the modern era, in more not serious philosophical circles, but in kind of pop culture, a common question asked by atheists, of 20 years ago was, well, if God created everything, then who created God? Would be a question that would often get asked, for example. The issue is that it's a failure to understand what actually designates God as God by nature, right? One of the inherent characteristics of divinity is eternality by definition. Otherwise, it's not a God. That's philosophically the basic kind of point. And again, it's something which even the pagan philosophers like Aristotle and others accurately deduced. Okay? The ways in which the ancient pagan gods were divine is almost in the kind of sense in which Superman operates in comic books in the 20th century, right? They're kind of superhumans, is really functionally what they end up being. They look like us, they act like us, they're equally as petty and capricious and vindictive and vengeful and warlike as us. But they just have extreme powers and they have control over certain elemental principles. Hence the concept of the stoicheia, or the elementary principles, that's been referenced twice now here. Right? In this particular case, and you see kind of examples like this, right? So every ancient pagan religion has a deity of the sea, right? It could be Neptune for the Romans, Poseidon for the Greeks, various different others across different cultures. There is always a deity of the sky or of thunder, Zeus for the Greeks, Odin and Thor, for example, among the Norse, so the Vikings, etc., etc. You always have a sun deity. This could be Apollo for the Greeks. It can be Ra for the Egyptians, right? You get all these kinds of examples of deities attributed or ascribed to certain elements in the natural world. The sun, the moon, Apollo and Artemis, right, the twins. In Greek mythology, you get this kind of imagery. And that works its way all the way down to even the more seemingly kind of small or trivial things, right? I mentioned Achilles earlier, okay? So his mother, Thetis, was a sea nymph, which is kind of almost like a mermaid figure, if you want to think of it that way. You get spirits of the forest and of the trees and of rivers and other such things, right? All the way down from the kind of small natural elements around us all the way up to the heavens, and like, in other words, what we call space, right? The stars, the planets, etc. You have deities ascribed and attributed to powers reflecting or relevant to those particular things, okay? This is where that term of elementary principles or stoicheia, that's what that's referring to, right, in a very more practical sense, okay? What that means, and this is where the enslavement part comes in as we now just start to unpack verse 8 even more, is in regards to the way in which daily life would actually operate, okay? Under the pagan worldview, again, regardless of culture effectively, because deities or gods were attributed powers over and kind of reign, R-E-I-G-N, reign over certain elementary principles, to have any meaningful interaction with those in the world as just a mortal man would then require interaction with that particular deity. Okay, this is why pantheons, as a concept, were a thing that obviously came to exist very, very quickly. Okay, so pantheon, pan from the Greek all, theos, God, so all the gods, right? The pantheon of gods, meaning all the different deities that are part of our culture or our religion, right? Always tied to our nation as well, by the way, is that you would then need to interact with multiple deities even just in your daily life, right? Say, and there's all kinds of examples we could use here. Which one do I feel like using this time? Let's go with a farmer. Okay, keep it simple. Actually, you know what? We'll go with the hunter. That would be more interesting. I've used the farmer a lot. We'll go with the hunter, right? I live in this time here. We'll keep it contextually relevant as well. So I live in the Hellenistic culture, right? So Greek culture. I'm going out hunting. I live near Marathon, where the ancient battle took place, of course, after which the running race is named, after the runner who was sent from the Battle of Marathon back to Athens to tell about the victory occurred, right, back in 490 BC. And I'm going hunting, and I'm going to hunt stags so that I can then go into the marketplace in the Areopagus of Athens, near the Areopagus of Athens, and I can sell my meat there. Okay, I'm a hunter, also involved in butcher. I'm going to sell it to the butcher and then make money and profit there. Right. I need to first of all make sacrifice to Artemis, the goddess of, among other things, the hunt and hunting, right, and of nature. It's her realm and her domain. I need her blessing that I will find the stag to hunt, that I will, of course, not die in the process, that the meat will be good, etc., etc. So I need to make sacrifice to that. As I'm also then heading to Athens, it's important that I also make sacrifice to Athena, given that I'm heading to her city, Athens. Right? She's the patron goddess of Athens, of course, and named as such. So I need her blessing to be able to enter the city and do business. I'm then also going to need the blessing of Poseidon, because that meat may well be getting shipped off to another place if the butchers decide to sell it outside of Athens. So now I need to make blessings to Poseidon, who will then guard and protect the ship as it carries its cargo along the way. Whilst I'm there, I will also probably make sacrifice to Zeus as well, as king of the gods, that all of this kind of confluence of sacrifice goes in accordance with each other. There is also more than likely not going to be sacrifice potentially to Apollo, although that depends on how the day goes, for various reasons to do with the weather and to do with the operation of the sun. Just that alone, and there's more complexities to that would be involved, but there's already 3, 4, 5 deities that I would need to make sacrifice to just before I actually embark on a basic hunting trip, right? This is the nature of how these things kind of go, and they become even more pedantic depending on what you're talking about. If you worked in anything to do with shipping or the sea, you're of course constantly making sacrifice to Poseidon. There are various other things all the way down to, as well, again, I may be entering a certain forest, and there are certain spirits and deities associated with that forest that I'll need to make sacrifice to. And the spirit associated with that, with the river that runs through that forest, I will also need to make sacrifice to, because I'm going to cross that river to get to the actual territory where the stags are located, right, etc., 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 etc. There's all kinds of ways in which this works, down to very finicky level, and so you're constantly making sacrifice. You're constantly engaging in these kinds of rituals that govern, and govern is the more generous term, your daily life down to the nth degree. Your everything from external things, so from work, family life, the home, all kinds of things, social interactions. There's no manner of end to the way in which the elemental principles control every single last facet of your life. And this is why the Apostle Paul describes it as enslavement. Okay? Every single pocket of your life in ancient pagan culture is enslaved to the elemental principles, aka the gods, to the stoicheia, right, which is just the broader term for all of these things, right? That's what's being kind of elucidated here. That's what's being described, right? There is no end to the complexity of how far that goes down, right? That's what I'm saying to you. It's not just, I used work as an example there, but this goes for everything, because before you left the house that day, you already would have made a number of sacrifices to various other deities as well, for the home, for food, for all kinds of things, the protection of your wife and children, all manner of things. Right? This is why it's described as enslavement. Sometimes that's even a more literal, the enslavement is even more literal. It's not what he's specifically referring to here, but in a number of the different pagan cultures of the ancient world, the enslavement was much more obvious and literal. So, for example, in that of the Babylonian mythologies, the short version is that Marduk, the national god of Babylon, arises to wage war against Tiamat, who is this goddess serpent of chaos, right? Who ruled the world and who brought chaos to the world as a dragon figure. Right? Marduk, who is a warrior, rises to wage war against the ancient goddess of chaos, this serpentine figure, and he creates mankind from the earth. Right? You can see how it's mimicking the biblical story to a degree, as his personal slave army to then wage war against Tiamat. They win, right? And then the people are the slaves of Marduk, right? So in that case, mankind was literally created as slaves in the Babylonian view, right? Which later informs their imperial actions by the time you get to the days of the Babylonian Empire, or what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which we read about, of course, in the days of figures like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel particularly, right? As Babylon became the preeminent superpower in the ancient world. So, this is the kind of enslavement. It is an enslavement that goes all the way down to every single action that you ultimately end up taking in life, and that is the nature of ancient paganism. It's the nature of any false religion, quite frankly. Even in the modern sense, now obviously we're fast-forwarding beyond the first century, but this very same concept governs everything else as well. Now, an important caveat here, which is where we're kind of coming to the more of the climax of this concept of enslavement to elemental principles. As I'm talking about all these things in regards to paganism and about it governing every facet of your life, it should be understood that that's also equally true in the one true religion, ours, okay, in Christianity. God is also sovereign and in charge of everything in our lives, and to think of it differently would be a bad idea. And in fact leads us to bad ideas and leads us to far more problems than we're ever capable of handling. In fact, the problems usually come when we think that there is some area of our life that we know how to govern or to dictate better than he does, and so then we toddle off on our way and end up stumbling and falling off a cliff somewhere at some point. So it's not as if the enslavement aspect is somehow being paralleled with some kind of libertine philosophy that exists in Christianity, because it doesn't, right? We'll get onto the word liberty as we start to move later on through the rest of this passage soonish, right? And what that specifically means. But we see, for example, in both Old and New Testament, right, both of them, that, and in fact, actually, we've already seen it in Deuteronomy in our sermon series on Sundays, is that in the case of Deuteronomy, in the case of the Exodus and the ancient Israelites, they were described as being freed from the house of slavery from the land of Egypt, right? So enslavement to the exact same kind of, in this case, Egyptian paganism that's in view, right, that we've been talking about. However, that enslavement is described as being redeemed, being bought or being purchased with a price, right, if you're familiar with that language. And the concept is then that they've been freed from slavery to Egypt and the Egyptian gods, and are now the slaves of the Lord. Right? The slavery doesn't end, it just transfers. However, again, what happens is we come thousands of years later, post-Enlightenment, post-abolition movement of like the late 18th, early 19th century, particularly in the West, right, when slavery was outlawed. And we view inherently today slavery as an absolute evil. Okay? Now, don't misunderstand, this is not me proposing that we reintroduce slavery. That's not the point I'm making. I don't have slaves, I don't have a horse in the race either. So I'm not trying to defend something that I have. Slavery in itself is not an absolute evil. So by absolute evil, what I mean is that such a thing is by nature evil at all times in all places, right? Murder is an absolute evil, right? There's a difference between murder and killing, but murder, so the unjustified taking of life, is an absolute evil, right? Rape is an absolute evil, right? Et cetera, okay? There's no specific scenario in which it goes from being immoral to moral, okay? That's an absolute evil, right? All times, all contexts, that's evil at that point, right? Slavery is not an absolute evil. It can be evil, especially in the way it's conducted. The conduct is really the way in which it's done. It can also be evil depending on how it's achieved. So, for example, if a raiding party invades another territory for the specific purpose of capturing and enslaving people, that would be evil. Okay, the Bible says that rather clearly. The institution, for lack of a better term, of slavery is not in itself an absolute evil, right? But it can be done in an evil form. Okay. That seems very odd to say in the modern age, but it's only odd in the modern age, right? Because we have, in the West, abolished slavery, right? Which is fine. It's not, I'm not saying we have to go back to that. But what we can't do is then, with long nose, kind of look back down through the annals of history and condemn the rest of human history based on our modern views on the subject, right? Otherwise, what you end up doing is condemning God when God has slavery and doesn't abolish it, or when he tells, like in the case of Philemon and Onesimus, to go back to your slave master because you're both Christians now, and he's to treat you like a brother and you're to serve him well. Or you have scenarios where God blesses Job with a bunch of things, which includes slaves, right? If we use the modern precept, we've now got God sinning in Job by giving him slaves. It doesn't work, right? Slavery, more times than not, especially the way it was often conducted in the ancient world, could obviously be brutal and horrific, and at times it could save people's lives who were otherwise destitute and who otherwise have suffered and languished in their own destitution, right? It's why you get to points where, especially in highly civilized places like Rome, doctors and lawyers are often slaves, and they live better than every single Roman plebeian, right? So in this particular case, the slavery is described as a form of liberation. It's, in terms of the divine aspect I'm talking about, getting back to the Egyptian example, redeeming the ancient Israelites from enslavement to the horrors of Egypt, and also the literal physical slavery in which they lived under, freeing them from that, and now they become slaves or servants of God, keeping in mind that in the ancient world, by and large, not always, but more times than not, the words that we consider as slave and servant were fundamentally the same thing. Okay, we tend to again think of it differently today. It's why certain Bible English translations try to move away from the word slavery because of its connotations now, but they're fundamentally the same thing. There is a distinction in some cases, but generally a slave and a servant, it's the same thing. So having that understanding then hopefully is giving us a kind of well-rounded picture of what's being described here in verse 8. I know we spent a lot of time bits because there's multiple layers of complexity to this verse, right? At that time, in former times, from his point of view, now what we call the first century, saying in the ancient world, the time past, right, when you did not know God, the one true God, the Lord, you were slaves to those things which are by nature no gods or not gods. They're not truly God, right? They're worshipped as such, they're honoured, they're venerated as such, but they're not truly gods. They are demonic powers. They are great legendary men who have achieved incredible things, who have then been honoured and venerated to the status of a god, what's called an apotheosis, right? The process of becoming a god, right? And they themselves, however, are not by nature gods. They were born. Every one of the ancient pagan deities at some point had a beginning, bar none. There's no exception to that. All the examples I've mentioned, like the Greek pantheon, so figures like Zeus and Athena and Poseidon and Artemis and Apollo, etc., all were born at some point, right, from a previous generation of gods. In this case, what we call the Titans in Greek mythology. Marduk was also himself, when I use the Babylonian example, also created again. None of these deities were ever actually just always there. right? The only thing that was ever always there in the ancient pagan worldview was either the sky or, in much more common examples, chaos. Usually the sky and the earth were actually born out of that primordial chaos, right? It's interesting, of course, because that's exactly, at least in terms of categorical terms, more or less what the Bible describes in terms of that primordial state, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was empty and without form, in other words, empty and void. And darkness was over the face of the deep, right? And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then he said, let there be light, right? To paraphrase. So we've actually talked about this many, many years ago now. This ancient primordial chaos. God creates the chaos and then orders the chaos, and that's what Genesis chapter 1 is. It's all this very highly structured ordering of this primordial chaos. Right? The tohu vabohu in Hebrew, the emptiness and the void, which are very, very ancient terms, is then ordered. And so that's why Genesis 1 follows a really structured, it's in days. It's why it's got the repetition of this phrase, right? Then God said blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah happened, and God saw that blah, blah, blah was good, and he blessed it one day, or day 2, or day 3, or blah, blah, blah. And each of the days correspond to the creating of the framework and then the filling of it, right? He creates the heavens, he separates the waters, creates the heavens. Day 1, then day 4 fills it with the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? And you just work your way down there. Creates the earth, fills it with trees, separates the waters, right? You get all the way down to the bottom. He then fills the land with animals and with mankind, right? There's this structure and then the filling of the structure, right? But all of that is preceded by the very first verse of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God. God did all this, right? Which means that God precedes all of these things, right? Even the chaos itself, okay, which is in those first 2 verses. Whereas in the pagan worldview, speaking of these elementary things, or these elemental principles, the chaos kind of just always existed. And then everything, first off, the sky deity and the earth deity, came forth out of that chaos. From them usually comes a whole series of other things like gods of time, gods of space, gods of the elemental principles like fire and earth and everything else, water, etc. And then from there, these more specific deities of the sun or the moon or this land or this river or this tree or whatever, right? There's this hierarchy, kind of in a fountain-like effect, right? But God precedes all of that. Even in Genesis, he precedes the chaos, whereas for the pagans, the chaos was the beginning of it all. Or in this case, not really beginning. It was just always there, right? He describes us as being enslaved, okay? All of this is because of what's being described, obviously, in the previous verses, as well as what we're now about to move on to, verse 9, okay? Verse 9, but now, having known God, or rather having been known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental principles to which you want to be enslaved all over again? Okay? Now, a number of things to unpack here. Obviously the beginning of that, but now, so he's drawing a contrast between the beginning of verse 8, however, at that time, verse 9, but now. Okay, so things past, and now the present and the future. Okay? But now, having known God, because of course part of verse 8 is, however, at the time when you did not know God, but now having known God, or rather having been known by God. Let's pause there with the having known God part. It's good to put a turn actually. Turn over to Acts chapter 17. Okay. So obviously the book of Acts comes just after the Gospel of John. In this case, Acts 17. I probably used the example of Marathon in Athens earlier because it was on my mind, right? In this case, in Acts chapter 17, the second half of it, the Apostle Paul is in Athens, okay? It's a very famous encounter. It's where he establishes the church in Athens, where ultimately, by tradition, the Church of Athens traces its roots to. And so again, this is one of the most important parts of Paul's journey. Of course, there are many important parts, but he comes to one of the most significant cities in the history of the world, which is, of course, Athens. Let's just begin in verse 22, right? Actually, no, I'll go back to verse 16, because it actually does, I don't want to talk about it at length, but I'll at least read from verse 16, because it gives you a picture of what I was talking about earlier, funnily enough. So verse 16 of Acts chapter 17. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, this is his travelling party. Whilst he was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, so Greeks, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. Okay, so the marketplace. I'll give you a bit of a lay of the land geographically, because it comes up here and you kind of need to know it a little bit. Athens, has anyone been to Athens? No? Have anyone seen a photo of Athens?
Yes.
Okay, most people sometimes often know, that's fine. Athens, of course, is famous for its Acropolis, and Acropolis just means a big hill. It's where the Greeks would put, so Acro, the highest or the top, polis, city, the highest point in the city. Right? Famous, of course, for the Parthenon, which is largely in ruins these days, thanks to the Ottomans storing artillery back in the 17th century and having it get blown up. But it has the temple to Athena, which is up there, and these days doesn't look like much because most of it is in ruins. However, in its heyday, which is back during this time, it's a bit after the heyday, but still very much in its heyday compared to today, the Acropolis is filled to the brim with votive stations, what are called votive stations or idols, right? So all these little places along the way where sacrifices will be made to all kinds. Archaeologically, the best estimates are somewhere between about 10 to 30,000 idols on the Acropolis, right? Roughly. It's hard to tell. Yes. Yes. No, that's it. Yes. That's right. Yeah. I took you through a 3D virtual tour. That's right. With the Acts Bible study. Yes. Yes, and that gave a good picture. Actually, it's good memory. It's not, obviously we don't know. We're only going off kind of archaeological or historical evidence, but it's in the tens of thousands, kind of low tens of thousands, right? Which is hard to picture when you're there, because you figure out how much room they must have had. You then come kind of west of the Acropolis. The Acropolis basically runs east to west, roughly speaking. And you then have the Areopagus, or the Areopagus, as we say in English, right? It was another smaller hill which kind of looks up to the Acropolis and the Parthenon, and it's where the Athenian council would meet, at least at certain points. It's where the High Council, the High Court of Athens, I'm using those in colloquial terms, would also meet. Important adjudications for the city would take place there, as well as more serious kind of public speaking events. Okay, that's what he's going to be getting onto in verse 22. To the north of that is, on the ground at sea level, effectively, is what we call the agora, right, or the agora, right? It's the marketplace, right? Very big marketplace, surrounded by other temples as well along the way, but it was the centre of Athenian commerce. Okay, so this is the marketplace that's being described in verse 17. He's travelling around the agora, where all this business is being conducted. And there are also, as I said, other temples and other idols along the way, not as heavily as it is in the Acropolis, but again, all those kinds of aspects we were talking about earlier of markets and sacrifices to deities for this type of business and that type of business and this type of business is going on there as well, right? Verse 18. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, those are the two main schools of philosophy during the first century by this point, the Epicurean school and the Stoic school. Their philosophers were conversing with him, right? So he's chatting with the Athenian philosophers. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" It's an insult. Babbler meaning one who one who kind of, yes, it's actually where we get the word barbarian from. Ultimately, barbar is a Greek kind of repetition, someone who speaks some foreign language that's not Greek. Others were saying to him, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, strange meaning foreign, right? Some foreign gods, because he was proclaiming the good news of Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, that's what I was referring to earlier, so the hill of Ares, okay, which is what that term means. The hill of Ares is the god of war in Greek mythology, otherwise known as Mars Hill in the Latin, and an important place for conducting these kinds of public speeches, right? And they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is of which you are speaking, for you are bringing some strange things to our ear," strange meaning foreign, "so we want to know what these things mean," right? They're interested, they're philosophers, they're always intrigued by all manner of intellectual conversations and pursuits, and they want to hear about this foreign deity that Paul is proclaiming, right? Verse 21 in parentheses, "Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there," right, the foreigners, "used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new." Verse 22, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects.'" Right, so very religiously devout. "For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" Okay, it's in that altar is basically in the middle of the agora, in the middle of the marketplace, right? And it was essentially there to more or less cover any other deities that they happened to have forgotten along the way, that could otherwise somehow come and smite their efforts. If they happened to forget to make a sacrifice, or if there was some deity which they hadn't otherwise been told about. This is kind of feeding into their idea of wanting to hear about this new foreign deity, because if we should be making sacrifices to him or to it as well, we need to make sure we have that covered. So they had one that would just simply cover to any unknown god that we don't currently actually worship or venerate or make sacrifices to. This one's for you. Yeah, cover their bases. Yeah, "Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you." Right. So what he's saying is that you have this altar in the agora to an unknown god, which is also technically true because you don't know the true God. Right. You've been cut off from the true God for thousands of years now by your own pagan culture. None of the men whom he actually started, of course, they are thousands of years descended from the time in which the Greeks, who are descended from Javan or Javan in English, they're descendants of Javan, who is one of the sons of Japheth, mentioned back in essentially Genesis chapter 6, roughly speaking. The ancestor of the Greeks is mentioned there. And so that's thousands and thousands of years by the time you get down to the first century here. This unknown God, this God whom they don't know, literally, he will now tell them about, right? Just to pause there, this is where the kind of wording that you get in verse 8 and 9 is so apropos, as it were. It's so kind of direct and so relevant. In this case, verse 8, he's talking about, again, however, at that time when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. The very kind of thing he's seeing in Athens, right? He's in Athens, by the way, before. Well, sorry, it's not true. He gets to Athens later on. So he's writing this letter before, to the Galatians I'm talking about, before he actually goes to Athens, right? So the very same thing he says here to the Galatians is the same kind of message he then ends up saying to these Athenians in Acts 17, right? But now having known God is what, of course, then verse 9 goes on to say. So in our case, for Acts 17, getting back to that, this is this same kind of thing, right? You don't know God. You don't know the true God. You're enslaved to these false gods, as we call them. However, what you worship in ignorance, I'll now proclaim to you. I'll now tell you about this unknown God, or this God who is unknown to you. The God who made the world and all the things in it, verse 24 of Acts 17. The God who made the world and all the things in it, since he is Lord of both heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. Right? So this God who made the world and all the things in it, including the primordial chaos, including the sky, including the earth, including the sun, the moon, and the stars, including all the trees, all the plants, all the animals, including everything that is known and seen, all the elemental principles, right? So it's, again, he's describing to them a deity. He's describing to them the kind of prime mover that Aristotle hearkened to. He is describing to them the true nature of this God, and it is the one who made the world and all the things in it, which is far more powerful and far higher than anything the Greeks ever worshipped anyway, right? Because none of the gods that the Greeks worshipped made any of those things, right? Zeus didn't make the world. Zeus didn't make anything other than lots of children. That's effectively what Zeus did. None of the gods that they worshipped, again, Apollo didn't create the sun. Artemis didn't create the moon. None of these things. They were deities who were given rulership or reign over those things, but none of them created them. Right? That's the difference. In this case, this is the God who made the world. So the world is cosmos here. When he says world, he doesn't mean like the planet Earth. The world is being used in the broader sense of cosmos, right? The universe, or everything that exists, right? The God who made the world and all the things in it, since he's Lord of heaven and earth, not just this river, or not just this planet, or not just this thing. No, he's the Lord of heaven and earth, of everything. Blah, blah, blah. Verse 26, and he made from one man, Adam, every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, right? So he creates nations. Nations are groups of people descended from the same people, right? Which is actually part of the word ethnos, where we get the ethnicity from. God determines the boundaries of those nations, right? What their borders are, and he determines their time, right? Until he determines when those nations stand and when they fall. Verse 27, that they would seek God, right? So this is more the purpose. So he describes the nature of humanity and then its purpose. Verse 27, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might claw or might grope, same kind of word, for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us, right? So in other words, he's describing very much what the Greeks were like with their philosophy, where they used the most sophisticated philosophy in the world, and they used the most advanced concept of logic that the ancient world ever saw to reason their way toward God, but never actually arrived there. Verse 28, for in him we live and move and exist, and even as some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring, right? So he's quoting Epimenides of Crete, primarily, who's an ancient Greek philosopher and poet. Verse 29, being then the offspring of God, we ought not to suppose that the divine nature, we're back to that concept again, is like gold or silver or stones, in other words, the things that you make idols out of, an image formed by the craft and thought of man, because that's ultimately what the Bible describes idols as. You make these little statues, or even big statues sometimes, like in the case of the gigantic colossal statue of Athena, which stood in Athens, which was I think in excess of about 50 feet. I need to go back and check. I can't remember. It was huge. Very, very tall there. So tiny little statues, or even big statues of bronze, of gold, silver, stone, various different things that were used in the ancient world. And these are your gods, and you have to pick them up, and you carry them around, and you put them down, and you polish it, and you bring it food, and you make sure it's nice and clean. Like, this is what you're doing. This is your little god, right? In this little statue or big statue, whatever it is, right? That constantly you have to keep taking care of. Right, you constantly have to clean it, you constantly have to do this, you constantly have to give it food, all these kinds of things, right? The kind of foolishness is almost in the actions itself, right? Hence why he says, as if he needed anything from us in those previous verses, right? Therefore, verse 30, having overlooked the times of ignorance, so referring to the past, so ignorance in this case literally gnosos, a meaning without, gnosos, knowledge, right? So we get the word like Gnosticism from. Ignorance is its Latin variant, ignoramus, meaning one without knowledge, right? So when someone is called an ignoramus, it means one without knowledge. It's why it's an insult, although often usually deserved. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, overlooked the times of lack of knowledge, God is now commanding all men everywhere to repent, right? So to turn back, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has determined, having furnished proof to all by raising him from the dead. So obviously, again, he's referring to Jesus. Right? So, why am I showing you all this? Well, obviously, again, you can see, hopefully, a lot of the kind of parallel in themes between what we've been looking at in Galatians 4 and what he says here later on, in time, that is chronologically, to the Athenians in Acts 17, right? The summation of this very, very easily probably one of, if not the most important sermon in Paul's life, probably actually the most, to be totally honest with you, one of the single most important sermons in all of the Bible, quite frankly, especially given its location, Athens, right, as one of the most significant cities in human history. The summation is essentially you in ignorance, in lack of true knowledge, right? Not, when he says ignorance, it doesn't mean like, oh, they're victims, although in one sense they kind of are, because all they're doing is following the paganism of their ancestors, right? But they're still responsible ultimately. What you've been doing in ignorance, these former times of ignorance, of pagan worship, of demon worship, of all the various things that come from that, all the horrors that come forth from that, God is now overlooking. In other words, he's not going to hail down judgment upon you for it like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He's not going to wipe you out, although at times that's been justified. Instead, he's now giving a command to all men everywhere. Jews, Greeks, Romans, Celts, pick a people, right? The Egyptians, the Libyans, the Chaldeans, i.e. the descendants of the Babylonians, etc. Persians, whatever. Times of ignorance, the times of paganism, the time of demon worship, it's over. That's done. That's all ending now. Now, the command from heaven is turn back to the one true God. Right? This is actually, incidentally, kind of what we saw on Sunday, right? At least in broad senses, right? Deuteronomy 12, which is where we are now, at the beginning of Deuteronomy 12, in the Sunday sermons, is very much describing, in that context, it's giving the command for the conquest of Canaan, right? That itself, remember how much of what we've been looking at in these first two lessons in Deuteronomy 12, right, through verses 1 to 5 now, is a microcosm, so in other words, a small example of the bigger macrocosmic example of the New Testament, right? The small example is the people of God, the nation, right? In this case, it was one nation, going into enemy territory, putting an end to evil, putting an end to darkness, putting an end to paganism, and replacing that with light, replacing darkness with light, replacing chaos with order, replacing evil with good, right? The places where this evil was done, God's bringing justice against it and putting an end to it, and now the one true religion will take its place, right? Everything in the Old Testament is a microcosm of the New Testament, in general terms, okay? All the various elements of the ceremonial law, especially in relation to things like the tabernacle or the temple, we then see fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus, especially in regards to the whole concept of sacrifice, right? That's why Jesus says, think not I have come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? I am the fulfillment of it, I'm the completion of it, right? So it's why, for example, again, all these kinds of various aspects regarding things like food laws or things like clothing laws, things like the Sabbath, again, we do uphold it for all of us who are in Christ because Christ himself upholds it, right? Christ did it, Christ accomplished it, he fulfilled it all. All of us who are in allegiance to him, that's then reflected to us. Right? He is the fulfillment of all of these things. The microcosm in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant becomes the macrocosm in the New Covenant or the New Testament. Right? The ending of paganism in one land, Canaan, becomes the ending of paganism in all lands, the world. Right? The people of God in one nation, the Israelites, become the people of God across all nations. Israelite, like I said, Greek, Roman, Celt, German, Slav, Egyptian, Ethiopian, pick a people. Microcosm to macrocosm. This is what's being described, right? That's why when we look at the conquest of Canaan, like we've got commanded in the beginning of Deuteronomy 12, that is the model for then what becomes later on, right? There are times where that is through conversion. There are times where, especially in the case of invasion, if those pagan nations then retaliate with invasion, there is times when, of course, then defence is required. It depends on the historical context. But ultimately, it's the ending of paganism by the destruction of pagan culture through conversion. That's ultimately how this operates, right? It's the spiritual reality. That's the kind of thing being described here. The times of ignorance, God is overlooking, or has overlooked, right? God is now commanding that all men everywhere repent, right? Turn back, okay? Flipping back over now to Galatians 4, so we can finish off the passage. But now, having known God, this is what's being described, right? That's why I wanted to show you Acts 17, because it gives you this really good image of this kind of comparison between the time in which you did not know God versus the time now that you do know God, right? However, he kind of gives a further explanation, or really almost like a caveat in a kind of colloquial sense, right? In verse 9 of Galatians 4. But now having known God, or rather, so in other words, he clarifies what he really actually means, or rather having been known by God. Okay? So what he's doing here is describing really what's called, what in technical terms in theology is called the ordo salutis, or the order of salvation. In simple terms, how does God actually save us? What is the order that occurs of things from start to finish? In this case, he describes the fact that it's not we who know God, but rather more directly or importantly, it's God who knows us, right? We haven't saved ourselves, God saves us, right? Every single component of our salvation is from God. It is instituted by God, it's executed by God, it's upheld by God, it's accomplished by God, right? Hence why everything down to obviously the grace of God. Even the faith that we have is described in Ephesians 2 as a gift from God, right? So the very faith that we actually have, that we exercise that faith, right? That faith itself initially is, of course, itself a gift from God, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Right, so having been known by God, really what he's doing is giving credence to the sovereignty of God, even in salvation, right? But his broader point, verse 9, and now having known God, or rather been known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental principles to which you want to be enslaved all over again? Right? This is what's interesting, right? Obviously, throughout this lesson, we've been talking a bomb load about ancient paganism, okay? That's been primarily the view. Because we need to understand those things, because that is the part of that context, especially of stoicheia, the elemental principles. However, the thematic context of the book of Galatians is in regards to what issue? The Judaizing heresy, right? You have Jewish converts in the Church of Galatia, a number of whom were former Pharisees, who are demanding that the Celtic Christians, some of them were Greek of course, but the Gentile, like the Celtic Christians, get circumcised in order to be saved, maintain the food laws in order to be saved, the clothing, all the ritual elements of the Mosaic Code, as necessary for salvation, right? So it's interesting that he then uses this phraseology here of going back to something in the context of this book, because what he's essentially describing is the fact that, at least in this wording and phraseology, especially in light of what we looked at in the previous lesson, of talking about the law, right, and that whole kind of Mosaic aspect being the kind of context in the first 7 verses, he's actually drawing a comparison between the enslavement to the ancient elemental principles of paganism and the Mosaic covenant. Now that might seem odd. Part of this, as I said, I actually mentioned this earlier in the lesson, part of this will need to wait till the end of this chapter, because he actually goes on to explain this through an analogy between Hagar and Sarah from the days of Abraham. But we'll leave that one to that passage when we get onto it, right? But he's describing the kind of enslavement that existed for pagans in the ancient world to the kind of enslavement that existed under the law in the Old Testament, right? Now again, this is important to understand. We haven't, in the new covenant, though we are freed from the burden of the law for salvation, it's not like the law goes away. That would be heresy, right? In fact, there's a heresy called antinomianism, from the Greek word nomos, meaning law. Okay, so antinomian, anti-law, right? A heresy which has kind of come back with a resurgence in the modern era, just not in that name and not to the same exact degree, although people do largely treat it that way, right? We're not. You often hear it in phrases like "we're not under law or under grace," for example, in church circles, right? No, wrong. In fact, the Apostle Paul actually kind of predicts that argument in the book of Romans and elsewhere, and says, "Shall we go on sinning even though grace abounds? God forbid," right? So you have people thousands of years later now making the same argument that even some were trying to make 2,000 years ago without even realizing it, right? No, the law of God must be obeyed, right? As founded especially and particularly in the Ten Commandments, which themselves are summarized by Christ as the two great commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. So the first table, second table of the law, right? Relating to the commands of God, then relating to man, right? Honor your father and mother, do not murder, do not steal, blah, blah. No, we uphold the law. Not that it saves us, but because the law is inherently good. It is the very definition of capital G, goodness, right? The law itself is not only a reflection of the divine character, but itself is actually sourced in the divine character, right? Who God is. It's a reflection of his being and his attributes. And therefore, to violate that law is to violate the divine being, is to violate God himself. Right? In this case, he is asking them this rhetorical question, which is rather blunt. Why is it that you're now that you've been known by God, now that you know God as an extension, why is it that you're turning back to the weak and worthless stoicheia, the elemental principles? Why are you turning back? Right? You've now known the new covenant. Why are you trying to turn back to the old covenant? Because the old covenant can't save you. Okay? The old covenant's over. The old covenant is ended, right? It's done. It's gone. It's now the new covenant that we're under. You're going back to something that couldn't save you, right? Because the old covenant wasn't designed to save. In that specific sense, it has its own purposes, some of which we've already actually been touched on, especially in chapter 3, when we looked at the threefold use of the law, right? But in this particular case, it's powerless to save. The law cannot save you. The law has multiple purposes, which is to restrain evil, which is to guide and direct in goodness, and which is to reflect your own sin, right? Your own inability to keep that law. That's the threefold usages, right? So we've used various analogies before, but the shield, the light, or in other words, the lamp, right? The fire, the shield, the fire, and the mirror, right? When we talked about the threefold use of the law, okay? Why is it you want to turn back to the weak and worthless things, right? The things which don't have the strength to save you, the things which are worthless because they're gone, they're old, right? It's gone now, the old covenant, right? To which you want to be enslaved all over again, right? Because that's ultimately what he's saying the Judaizers are doing. They are attempting to bring them back under the old covenant, especially through those more ceremonial aspects like we talked about, right? Food, like dietary laws, observance of the festivals, circumcision, etc., right? That's why he says in verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. That's just an aphorism, essentially, or an idiom for all these various festivals, right? Because again, the Judaizers were saying, no, you must observe Yom Kippur, and you must observe Hanukkah, and you must observe the Feast of Tabernacles or of Booths, right? You must do this, you must do that, right? All these various things, which again, were there for very good reason in the Old Covenant, right? Of course, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was the great high day of atonement, the sacrifice that would absolve the people of sin. That's a whole imagery, right? Very important for foreshadowing the sacrifice of Christ. So absolutely relevant and necessary. That the issue's not with that, but the one true sacrifice has now come. So Yom Kippur is irrelevant, right? Going and making sacrifices at the temple on Yom Kippur now doesn't do anything for you, right? Because the one true sacrifice has come, right? So like when we do, again, that's why the Christian approach to feasts and festivals is different, right? We have feasts. We have, in other words, like festivals, holy days, right, where we get the word holiday from. Advent and Christmas and Easter and various other things, Ascension and Pentecost, which we're obviously celebrating this Sunday, Ascension, next Sunday, Pentecost, right? That mark now, of course, revolving around the life and ministry of Christ, the Gospels and the Book of Acts, right? But it's not because anything that's done on Easter will save you. It's more than commemorative. It's commemorative and participatory, right? Just as Holy Communion is what we call a means of grace. So in other words, the grace of God is administered through Holy Communion. That's why when we had those COVID lockdowns and everyone went 6 months without communion, everyone and their dog was worse off for it, right? The grace of God doesn't just kind of magically ascend out of the sky somehow. God describes through those institutions, why we call them sacraments. There's two of them which were instituted by Christ, right? Baptism and communion. It's why he describes, like we have in the words of institution, this cup that we drink, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? And this bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Right? We become partakers of his body and of his blood, right? What's called the spiritual presence or the real presence of Christ in communion, right? It's in our confessional or in our doctrinal statement. They don't become those elements by substance. That would be a different view known as transubstantiation. But we become partakers of the body and blood spiritually. Right? More importantly, they're described as a means of grace, right? So God administers his grace to us as we become partakers of communion, right? Just as he administers his grace of salvation through baptism, right? Why the Apostle Peter goes on to say that baptism now saves you, not by the washing of dirt from the body, so it's not because of the element of water, but the appeal of a good conscience to heaven, right? So it cleanses us spiritually. That's the important part of baptism. All this is describing, however, again, this kind of phrase he's using in verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. It's describing this kind of enslavement to the elemental principles, right? The movements of the sun, the movements of the moon, the stars, all those kinds of elemental principles, which all had deities attached to them, or even in the Old Covenant context, had all kinds of festivals and observances and rituals associated with them, which God designed to, of course, point toward Christ and who he is and what he would do and all those various aspects of salvation. They had their place, but the emphasis there is had. They had their place. They were there for a very important purpose, right? If something was instituted by God to foreshadow the coming of the Christ and what he would do, well, once he's come, there's no more foreshadowing. That's fairly straightforward and logical, right? Right? If you have, and this goes, again, we know this just through any possible means, right? Let's just use something more public and obvious. In the lead up to any Olympics, the torch is lit, I believe from memory, from the previous city. I don't remember if they still do it through Athens, but anyway, it has a point where it goes to Athens, if my memory serves me correctly, but it's lit from the torch is lit from wherever the last Olympic Games were held. It then goes through a giant Harvey World tour all across the place to various different portions before it eventually arrives, of course, at the opening ceremony of that next Olympic Games, right? Well, once the Games begin, the torch doesn't just keep traversing off around the world tour because it's arrived at where it was coming to arrive, right? You don't keep doing the thing that's foreshadowing the thing once the thing has happened, right? It makes no sense, right? That's why it's not just unbiblical and it's not just sinful, but it's also just illogical what the Judaizers were attempting to do. You keep trying to do these things from the Old Covenant which were foreshadowing the thing that's now happened, right? this is what's so inherently corrupt about the Judaizing heresy. And it's why we have to be very, very careful with it, because there are different times in history that it's kind of reared its head. And it has, in one sense, we're in a period at the moment where it has to a degree reared its head again. Not in the same full-blown sense, right? So definitely not the same degree. I'm not painting that per se. But usually how these things go is they're kind of 1 or 2 degrees removed. You're down the garden path toward the thing, right? There are a number of different heresies that have popped up in the last 100 to 200 years where people can find themselves down the path toward the thing without actually ever arriving at the thing, right? That's still a dangerous move, right? So often these days it looks like, insisting either directly or indirectly on constantly using Hebrew, for example, right? Constantly trying to refer to Jesus as Yeshua, or using Hebrew terms from the Old Testament as kind of a standard. Often when people do that, not always, often when people do that, in my experience at least, it's done in a somewhat snobbish way. It's done in a somewhat, I'm speaking the more authentic way of things, right? Which it's not. It's not for the language thing. It's a really obvious one, because by the time you get to this period, basically no one's using Hebrew. Hebrew is effectively like what Latin is now. It's a functionally dead language with some specific usage, right? Like in law, medicine, and theology. That's basically where Latin's used, right? Or in the Roman Church, right? Hebrew is the same way. It's used in the temple, but outside of that, no one's using Hebrew. The Bible's not in Hebrew. Oh, sorry, there are little copies in Hebrew, but no one's using the Bible in Hebrew. It's all being used in Greek, right? Et cetera, right? God moved it away from Hebrew into Greek, very intentionally. It looks like modern Christians trying to observe all the Old Testament feasts, like Yom Kippur and Hanukkah and Feast of Booths and other such things like that, when again you're failing to understand the purpose of those things. They were foreshadowing, that's the back of my point I made earlier, those things foreshadowed the sacrifice, but the sacrifice has now happened, or various other things to do with Christ's life, right? It's not just the crucifixion, but it's all kinds of things to do with Jesus. You don't now keep doing the same thing, because it's already come and happened, right? It's not foreshadowing anything. That's back to my Olympic analogy, right?
So it kind of negates what Christ did, doesn't it, in a way? Like if you...
In a roundabout way, I guess so, functionally, sure. No, not intentionally. Oh, no, it's not intentionally, no. No, not intentionally, but no. No, not intentionally, not at all. But again, so for example, it would be like having... Again, there's all kinds of examples I suppose you could use. And you can kind of try to retroactively reorient the purpose in, as I said, a retroactive way, right? So you can try and do like a Passover Seder from the Old Testament in a retroactive way, but we already have that though, and we do it every week. It's called Holy Communion. That is the Passover Seder. Like that's exactly what that is. It's the cup and the bread, right? So to do it from the Old Covenant, which is foreshadowing, looking forward to, we already have the fulfillment of it, which is in Holy Communion. That's why Christ instituted the Last Supper, right? Do you know what I mean? And so that's where it runs into, again, it just doesn't, what it ultimately ends up doing is conflating the Old and New Covenants, right? Because there's plenty of correspondence and overlap between the two, right? Especially given that the means of salvation has always been the same, faith, right? We've talked about this already, especially in chapter 3, right? How was Abraham justified, i.e. made righteous? By faith, right? Abraham, the just or the righteous, shall live by faith. Before the circumcision of Isaac, before any of those things, Abraham was already justified by faith, right? The faith comes before any of those ritual elements at all, right? In the story of Abraham, when you read it, we've talked about this in the last chapter, right? And so the observance of these things in the ritual context, particularly and especially, which is more the issue of the Judaizing heresy, for salvation, that's where it becomes heretical, right? These, in other words, saying these various things are necessary for salvation. In other words, without it, you'll be damned, right? That's where the heresy comes in, okay? That's what he's touching on, right? Hence why he says, to which you want to be enslaved all over again, right? Going all the way back to it, right? This is the fundamental problem of Islam. Islam effectively revives the old covenant, right? Every single religion, no matter at what particular point, dictates all aspects of your life. As I said earlier in the lesson, right? Especially as we're coming to the end here in verse 11, which there's not much to explain, but because verse 11 really is better explained by verse 12, which I'll leave till the next lesson. Every religion has dictates and determinations for aspects of your life. That is kind of the purpose of religion. At least one of them. Even those who are not non-religious do the exact same thing. They just outsource that to themselves, right? So every single facet of their life is now determined by themselves, right? And what they feel or what they think, right? There's no escaping that reality. That's just part of the human experience, right? The question is not whether these various aspects of your life will be dictated. The question is what will dictate these aspects of your life. And I would much rather have the one true God dictate these things than me. Or, worse yet, maybe even worse yet than me, things which are by nature lesser beings, the gods. One of the most astonishingly stupid parts of paganism is the intentional decision to worship and honour things which, by their own admission, are lesser beings. Gods which were created. Right? Gods which only have dominion over some specific pocket of the creation. Even really powerful ones, like in the Greek things, we're using that context, like Apollo. Apollo, by and large, in the ancient Greek legends and mythologies, has basically jack squat influence over the sea. That's the realm of Poseidon. So I'm worshipping created beings with a finite, limited power over a specific section of the creation. Why? Or the only eternal God, again, eternality is actually a true characteristic of true divinity anyway, who created all the things in existence, whose power is not limited, whose authority is not limited, whose sovereignty is not limited, and who actually governs and controls all the heavens and the earth. Right? The question is not whether, but rather which. Right? And in this particular case, as mentioning with Islam or with any other religion, it does the exact same thing. The question is rather, as I said, not whether or not your life will be governed by these things. The question is which. In other words, which of these things will govern your life, right? It can be ourselves. That's the essence of atheism. Although that usually ends up not being the case, because usually you end up ascribing or adhering to some political philosophy or some social cause or something else that ends up actually dictating your life anyway. And there's all kinds of things that prevail. You become, you have a significant political allegiance to a certain political party or a certain cause, like environmentalism or such and this and that or whatever, right? So it's actually you think you're doing it yourself, really, you're actually just outsourcing it once again. Or it's pagan religions, and I'm just using pagan in the broad context here of anything but ours. It becomes Judaism, it becomes Islam, it becomes Hinduism, it becomes whatever, or it becomes some a la carte hodgepodge of Western occultism and Eastern mysticism, which prevails up here to a degree, right? Which is even worse, because you're grounding yourself in basically your own buffet selection of religious principles, which you have no real meaningful understanding of usually in the first place, and you hold on to them with such fickle grip that as soon as they become even mildly inconvenient, you dump it for something else, and that's just usually how this kind of new religious neo-pagan stuff goes. You're always in servitude to something. That is the essence of the human experience. The question is not whether you will be, the question is what. In the case here, you have the Judaizers attempting to enslave the Celtic and Greek Christians back under the Old Covenant as necessary for salvation. So you must get circumcised or you won't be saved. You must uphold these food laws or these festivals or these observances, or you won't be saved, blah, 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 right? It's dangerous. And so this is why Paul is angry. It's why he's lamenting even in verse 11, I fear for you that perhaps I have laboured over you for nothing. Perhaps I put in all this effort that's come to naught. Right? He doesn't. Obviously, if the book of Galatians ended on that verse, it would be horribly demure and astonishingly depressing. But fortunately, it doesn't end at verse 11. Right? He's not giving up on them. Right? He's expressing to them his genuine lament over how much effort he has put in. Keeping in mind, by the way, that Paul was beaten within an inch of his life in Galatia. Right? Back in Acts chapters 11, 12, 13, roughly speaking, he gets stoned almost to death in Derbe, right? Which is one of the southern Galatian cities where the church, where he founded a church, right? Galatia's a region. Again, there's four main. You've got Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Pisidian Antioch. These are the four churches of southern Galatia, so that's why, of course, it's written to the Galatians. It's this region, right? So Paul has sacrificed health and body in Galatia for their sake, right? He does, almost in the literal sense, have skin in the game, ironically. When he was there with Barnabas, he was stoned, almost dead, right? Extremely badly beaten, right? So he's put his body on the line literally for these people, and now they're abandoning everything that they're abandoning everything he founded, right? So there's a sense of betrayal that he does feel naturally, right? But he doesn't then turn around and kind of throw his hands up in the air and just call it quits, right? The very fact that he's writing this letter kind of indicates that, right? He's trying to turn them back to truth, right? So St. Paul's honour and integrity should never be questioned from even a cursory reading of these letters. He actually genuinely cares about them, that even though, again, they are in a sense betraying him because he is the one who founded these churches, he is the one who taught them, he is the one who almost died for them in Derbe, right? But he's not giving up on them because he is a spiritual father to them, right? Like he refers to himself as a spiritual father to the Corinthians. It's why, just as a very tiny little historical bit of trivia, it's why clergymen have often throughout Christian history been referred to as father. It's not in the sense of taking God's place, it's in the sense of spiritual fatherhood. It's kind of like a parent to a child, right? Because the Apostle Paul refers to himself as a father to the Corinthians. But either way, different Christian traditions have different views on that. So that's essentially the end. There's nothing much to talk about in verse 11 because it's just a lament. He continues on in verse 12 and following, right? So we'll obviously move on through the rest of the passage in the next lesson. But yeah, deep historical and philosophical elements here that hopefully have kind of come through well enough, at least as far as I could summarise them. The former times of enslavement to the elementary principles, the stoicheia, in the pagan context, pagan culture, the gods, all the religious and ritual elements. In the case of the Israelites, the Old Covenant. He's drawing a comparison between those two as being not literally the same thing, right? But alike. Okay, it's why the ancient Israelites went off the track so often, and half the time, 3/4 of the time, they're worshipping idols anyway, right? And they're worshipping idols at the temple, and they're doing these kind of things, blah 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 blah. That former time is past from his at his time period, saying the ancient world, the former things, the former paganism, the age of darkness is over. God's now changing things, right? It's why, and I'm going to run the risk of leaving with this because we can explain this at other points throughout this letter, but it is actually really much more the intention behind phrases that we find in the Bible, like new creation or new heavens and new earth, for example. We tend in the modern age to think of, and usually most people are familiar with that from Revelation 20, 21, 22, because that's the more prominent example of this kind of phrase, the new heavens and the new earth. However, the quotation there, and it is a quotation in Revelation, the new heavens and new earth is not only confined to those ending chapters of Revelation. It's a quotation from the end of Isaiah, right? And Isaiah, chapter 66, looks forward to the new heavens and the new earth, okay? And therein he describes, he's using again the kind of typical language that Isaiah and the other prophets use. It's very vivid, it's usually quite hyperbolic, right? This is just how God talks to them anyway, to describe these kinds of things. And it describes, among other things, people being born and living and dying. Okay. The question comes, right? If we think of it in the modern sense of the way that new heavens and new earth kind of tends to colloquially get used at the moment in evangelical circles, of the end of the world, the day of judgment, and then the new heavens and the new earth, like that's when that happens. The thing that, however, that you have happening in the original description in Isaiah is people dying. Obviously, we don't believe after the day of judgment that there will be death anymore. That's just kind of standard Christian doctrine. It's not negotiable, right? When we're resurrected on the day of judgment, we're resurrected, right? We're not going to die anymore. Death will be abolished at that point, right? We didn't have death in the garden until it was introduced through sin. The ending will be the removal of death once again, right? It's a return back to Eden. That's the whole entire point of the Bible, right? If you have people dying in the description of Isaiah, that poses questions, right? Namely, that by necessity it can't be talking, at least not exclusively, about the eternal, what we kind of call the eternal state, or beyond the day of judgment or the day of resurrection, because there is no death there, right? The way in which Isaiah is using the term new heaven and new earth is the same kind of way that the Apostle Paul uses the term new creation. Right? So in Colossians he describes it as a new creation in Christ, right? It's a lovely passage, right? My body didn't disintegrate when I was baptized. I'm still me, right? But I'm made a new creation, a new creature, spiritually, right? I'm still me. I'm still descended from my ancestors. I'm still this skin colour, that hair colour, this eye colour, blah, 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 right? It's not describing the material, it's describing the spiritual. That's the same context in which Isaiah speaks, as does the New Testament. The new heavens and the new earth is not talking about the material. The reason why we know that is from Isaiah is that, A, for starters, it's at the end of a passage which talks about the new covenant. That's the context in Isaiah 66. And B, you have death being referenced, right? So it clearly can't be talking about beyond the resurrection, right? Because there is no death at that point. That's the entire point, right? He's talking about the new heavens and the new earth. He's talking about the distinction between exactly what the Apostle Paul here is describing, the old world and the new world. It's also the same reason, or the same kind of language that Paul uses. This age and the age to come often, at times at the moment in history, gets interpreted as this current world versus beyond the day of judgment. That's not the context in which that gets used, at least not by Paul. This age, this time, that time, ancient paganism, the old covenant, versus the age to come, new covenant. Right? That's why we divide history that way. Before Christ, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Right? That might be new to you. I promise you it's not new to Christian theology. It's not history. It's not new to the history of the church. In fact, many of the early church fathers write about it in this way, of describing the world as two different worlds in this kind of language. Right? The old world, paganism. The new world, Christianity. Right? Or the old world, the old covenant in the Israelite context, and now the new covenant. Right? Depending on what you're talking about. The new heavens and the new earth, right? As opposed to the old world and the old earth, the old heavens and the old earth, which were polluted with paganism and darkness, and in which the world was en masse to the 99th degree, other than this one sliver of one tiny people group here, the rest to darkness and paganism. Now, you've seen the reversal of that for 2,000 years and counting. We're not there yet, right? But it's all been reversing. Right? So in the ancient world, almost entirely pagan. For 2,000 years, ever increasingly Christian. Paganism being abandoned, paganism being abolished, paganism being completely forgotten, right? New heavens and new earth. That's what that means, right? And we know that. I'm saying we know that because in Isaiah's, the original passage, again, Revelation is just quoted from Isaiah. In Revelation, as in Isaiah, more importantly, you have death. There's death in Isaiah's reference, right? He uses it in a figurative sense, right? So he says, the young man who dies at 100 will be considered to have died before his time. I'm paraphrasing here, right? Nonetheless, beside that point that he's drawing there as an analogy, you can't, if it's talking about beyond the day of judgment or beyond the resurrection, you can't have death, right? He's not speaking about the material world or the world materially. He's speaking about the world spiritually, right? That's what's here. The old world, new world. The time in human history before Christ and the reordering of the world in the year of our Lord, right? The time after Christ, right? There you go.